Get your hands off the merchandise. People like you don't belong in a place like this. He said it loud enough for everyone in the showroom to hear. Loud enough that the couple near the back window looked up from the display case they'd been studying. Loud enough that the young receptionist at the front desk pretended to be very, very busy with something on her computer screen. The man who said it was named Brendan Thackeray, and he had worked as floor manager at Hargrove and Whitfield Fine Jewellers on Bloor Street West for 11 years. He wore his authority like a second suit, shoulders back, chin lifted, voice carrying just enough edge to make people shrink. The woman he said it to was named Althea Drummond-Price, and she did not shrink. She was 53 years old, wearing a camel-colored wool coat that had seen better days, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a canvas tote bag from the Toronto Public Library hanging off one shoulder. She had driven in from Scarborough that morning, in a 10-year-old Civic with a cracked dashboard. She'd stopped for a medium coffee at Tim Hortons on the way, and she still had the cup in her hand when Brendan Thackeray walked up to her and said what he said. She looked at him over the rim of her glasses. She did not say a word. That's the thing nobody talks about when they tell this story. They talk about what came later, and we'll get there, believe me, we'll get there. But what people don't talk about is that first moment. The silence Althea Drummond-Price held on to like something precious, while Brendan Thackeray waited for her to apologize, or explain herself, or leave. She didn't do any of those things. She set her Tim Hortons cup down on the glass counter, very gently, and turned to look at the display case she'd been examining before he interrupted her. If you want to understand what happened that Tuesday morning on Bloor Street, you need to understand what Hargrove and Whitfield is, and what it used to be. The store had been on that block since 1961. Old Arthur Hargrove had opened it with his brother-in-law Douglas Whitfield, after both of them came back from working the mines up in Sudbury. They'd saved for years. The original location was a narrow little shop, barely wider than a hallway, with a handwritten sign in the window and 2 display cases Arthur had built himself out of reclaimed wood and glass he'd sourced from a greenhouse that was being torn down. By the 1980s, Hargrove and Whitfield had a reputation. Not flashy, not ostentatious, just reliable. The kind of jeweler where 3 generations of the same family would bring their business, where a man could walk in with a modest budget and be treated with the same respect as someone spending $10,000. Arthur Hargrove died in 1994. Douglas Whitfield retired to Nova Scotia in 2001 and sold his half of the business. The store changed hands twice after that, and each time it moved a little further from what it had been. By the time a corporation called Prestige Retail Holdings acquired it in 2009, the handwritten sign and the reclaimed wood cases were long gone. There was marble flooring now, a security guard at the door, staff who had been trained explicitly to assess customers before approaching them, to make certain judgments, to protect, as management put it, the integrity of the shopping environment. What that meant in practice, most of the staff understood perfectly well, even if nobody said it out loud. Brendan Thackeray had not invented this culture, but he had flourished in it. Althea Drummond-Price walked into Hargrove and Whitfield on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 6 weeks before the Tuesday morning in question. She'd been passing by. She had an appointment nearby and arrived 20 minutes early, so she ducked into the store to get out of the wind. She hadn't intended to look at anything seriously. But then she'd noticed the vintage section at the back. Estate pieces, mostly, rings and brooches from the 40s and 50s, and she'd slowed down. There was an Art Deco brooch in the second case. Platinum setting, old cut diamonds arranged in a fan shape, a single cabochon sapphire at the center. The kind of piece that didn't get made anymore, not the same way. She'd stood there for a long time, looking at it. A young woman named Celeste Okonkwo had come over and opened the case without being asked, laid the brooch on a velvet tray so Althea could see it properly. They'd talked for almost half an hour. Celeste knew her stuff, knew the period, knew the maker's mark, knew the history of the original owner, as far as it could be traced. Althea had liked her immediately. She didn't buy the brooch that day. She said she needed to think about it. Celeste said that was completely fine, gave her a card, told her the piece wasn't going anywhere. Althea came back a second time the following week, a third time the week after that. Each time she wore the same coat, the same canvas tote, the same reading glasses. Each time she spent a long time in the vintage section. Each time she spoke with Celeste, if Celeste was working, or browsed on her own if she wasn't. She never bought anything on those visits. Brendan Thackeray noticed. He had a particular gift, he believed, for reading people. He could tell. He said to his assistant manager, a man named Kurt Friesen. He could tell within 30 seconds of someone walking through the door, whether they were serious buyers, or whether they were just wasting everyone's time. He'd had his eye on the woman in the camel coat since her second visit. Something about her didn't sit right with him. She came in too often, spent too long looking, asked too many questions, didn't buy anything. To Brendan, this added up to something he called browser behavior, which was a polite way of saying he didn't trust her. On her fourth visit, he followed her through the store, stayed close, positioned himself between her and the display cases when he could. When she reached out to point at something through the glass, he said, sharply, "Please don't touch the cases." She had not been touching the cases. She had been pointing. She looked at him. Said nothing. Moved to a different section of the store. On her fifth visit, the Tuesday morning in question, he was waiting. She came in at 10:40. The store had been open for 40 minutes. There were 3 other customers, 2 women looking at engagement rings near the front, and a man in a business suit examining watches at the side wall. Celeste was with the engagement ring customers. Kurt Friesen was helping the man with the watches. Brendan was at the floor manager's station near the back, but he wasn't doing anything that couldn't wait. He watched Althea come in. She nodded at the security guard, a retired transit worker named Walton, who nodded back pleasantly. She moved through the store the way she always did, unhurried, deliberate, pausing to look at things that caught her eye, working her way toward the vintage section at the back. Brendan walked over before she got there. "Can I help you?" The phrasing was technically polite. The tone was not. "I'm fine, thank you," Althea said. "Are you looking for something specific? I'll let you know if I need assistance." He stood there another moment. Then he moved away, but not far. She reached the vintage case. The Art Deco brooch was still there. She'd expected it would be. Beside it, a new piece had appeared since her last visit. An Edwardian necklace, seed pearls and gold filigree. The kind of delicate work that took weeks to produce. She leaned in close to look at it, her hands clasped behind her back. That was when Brendan Thackeray appeared at her elbow. "Get your hands off the merchandise," he said. "People like you don't belong in a place like this." The store went quiet. Celeste, across the room, looked up from the engagement ring she'd been describing. The 2 customers she was with stopped talking. The man with the watches turned his head. Even Kurt Friesen, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not noticing things that might require him to take a position, turned to look. Althea's hands were still clasped behind her back. She set her Tim Hortons cup on the counter. She looked at the display case. She said nothing. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Brendan said. His voice was quieter now, almost private, which was somehow worse. "You've been in here multiple times and you've never made a purchase. You're making the other customers uncomfortable." "Am I?" Althea said. "It wasn't a question. I'm going to ask you one more time. Brendan." It was Celeste's voice from across the room. She'd excused herself from her customers and was walking over, her face carefully neutral in that way people's faces get when they're controlling something they very much want to let out. "I'll take care of this section," Celeste said, coming to stand beside the display case. "I've got it handled," Brendan said. "I'm sure you do," Celeste said, pleasantly. "But Ms. Drummond Price is my client. I'll take care of her." Something shifted in Brendan's face. Not understanding, not yet, but the first edge of something uncomfortable. "Your client?" "Yes." Celeste smiled at Althea. "Good morning. The Edwardian necklace just came in on Thursday. I set it out because I thought you might want to see it." "It's beautiful," Althea said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I'd like to see both pieces together, if that's possible." Celeste was already opening the case. Brendan Thackeray stood where he was, in the middle of the floor, while his assistant brought out a platinum Art Deco brooch and an Edwardian gold filigree necklace and set them both on a velvet tray in front of a woman in a camel coat with a Tim Hortons cup and a library tote bag. He told himself later that he hadn't known, that there had been no way to know, that anyone would have done the same thing. He was still telling himself this when building security arrived to escort him from the premises 3 hours later. Here is what Brendan Thackeray did not know on that Tuesday morning. He did not know that Althea Drummond Price had, 18 months earlier, purchased a controlling interest in Prestige Retail Holdings. He did not know that Prestige Retail Holdings owned Hargrove and Whitfield Fine Jewellers, along with 4 other specialty retail locations in Toronto, 2 in Vancouver, and 1 in Calgary. He did not know that Althea had spent the previous 6 weeks visiting each of her newly acquired properties incognito, a practice she'd developed years ago, something her first mentor in the business had called walking the floor. Seeing what things were actually like when the executives weren't watching. He did not know that Althea Drummond Price had started her career at 22, sorting mail in the shipping department of a textile distributor in Brampton, and that she had spent the next 3 decades building, selling, acquiring, and restructuring businesses with a methodical intelligence that had made her quietly one of the more significant retail investors in English Canada. He did not know any of this, because he had looked at her coat and her tote bag and her Tim Hortons cup, and he had decided in 30 seconds or less that he already knew everything he needed to know about Althea Drummond Price. He had been wrong. Celeste had known for 2 weeks. She hadn't been told officially. Nobody had. Althea preferred it that way. But Celeste was perceptive, and she'd done some research after the 3rd visit, and she'd put together enough to understand that the woman with the reading glasses and the canvas tote was not someone she should treat carelessly. More to the point, Celeste would have told you herself that she would have treated Althea with the same courtesy regardless. She treated everyone that way. It was not a strategy. It was just how she did her job. That morning, after Brendan had retreated to the far end of the store to conduct a furious whispered conversation with Kurt Friesen, Celeste brought out the 2 pieces and stood back and let Althea take her time. They talked about the brooch first, the history of it, the weight of the platinum, the particular quality of the old cut stones, which had a depth to them that modern brilliant cuts didn't replicate. Then the necklace. Celeste had researched the filigree technique, traced it to a workshop in Birmingham that had operated between 1904 and 1912, found a similar piece in an auction catalog from Sotheby's in 1987. Althea asked questions. Good questions, careful questions, the kind that came from someone who had been thinking about something for a long time. After 40 minutes, she said she'd take both pieces. Celeste wrote up the sale. It was, including taxes, just over $31,000. Althea paid with a card she took from a slim leather wallet inside the library tote bag. It was the receipt that ended things for Brendan more than anything else. He was in the back office when Celeste ran the transaction. He was composing, in his head, a version of events that would satisfy his area manager. He'd been protecting the store's assets, following procedure, exercising the judgment he was paid to exercise. The woman had been suspicious. Anyone would have agreed. Then Kurt Friesen came to the office door. His face was doing something complicated. "You need to see this," Kurt said. The receipt was for a sale to A. Drummond Price. Beneath the customer name, because Celeste had looked her up in the system and found the account that had been created for her, was a notation that Brendan had never seen before on a customer account. It was 3 letters. OWN. It was the code the system used for the corporate accounts of ownership-level principals. He'd never had occasion to see it before, because the owners of Prestige Retail Holdings had never, in his experience, come into the store. He sat with that for a moment. "She owns the company," Kurt said helpfully. "I know what it means," Brendan said. He sat there a while longer. Then he called his area manager. The area manager's name was Philip Gearhart, and he arrived from the Prestige Retail Holdings regional office on Adelaide Street in under an hour. He was 50 years old and had spent his career in specialty retail, and he had never moved that fast to get anywhere, But he moved that fast that morning. He met with Althea for 20 minutes in the small consultation room at the back of the store. The one with the good lighting and the comfortable chairs where clients went to look at pieces privately. What happened in that meeting was, officially, a private matter. What became known was this: Brendan Thackeray was removed from his position that afternoon. Kurt Friesen received a formal written warning. The area manager issued a company-wide directive on customer conduct that was, to anyone who read carefully, a very clear description of the behavior that had occurred at the Bloor Street location that morning, and a very clear statement that such behavior would result in immediate termination. Walton, the security guard at the door, received a commendation. Celeste was promoted to assistant director of the Vintage and Estate Division, a newly created position with a title and a salary that reflected the fact that someone had finally noticed she knew considerably more than her job description had been allowing her to demonstrate. Brendan contested the termination. There was a process, documentation, a period of several weeks. At the end of it, the termination stood. The grounds cited were, in the careful language of human resources documents, conduct unbecoming a supervisory role and behavior inconsistent with the company's stated values regarding the equitable treatment of all customers, which was one way to put it. Althea, for her part, didn't talk about it much. She'd seen this before, in one form or another. Not always this blatant. Sometimes it was subtler, a longer wait, a slightly cooler tone, an assumption made visible only in the gap between how she was treated and how the person next to her was treated. She'd learned, years ago, that she had two choices every time it happened. Make it small, walk away, preserve her energy for things that mattered, or make it count. She made it count when she could, when there was something worth making. Hargrove and Whitfield on Bloor Street was one of the oldest jewelry retail establishments in Toronto. It had been through a lot of things: ownership changes, economic cycles, the slow extinction of the kind of craft knowledge that Celeste had, the institutional amnesia that set in when a business changed hands too many times. But there was still something there worth preserving. She came back to the store the following week, and the week after that. She came back not as an owner doing inspections, but as a customer, in her camel coat, with her Tim Hortons cup and her library tote bag. She learned the names of the staff. She asked about their families. She brought in a brooch from her own collection one afternoon, and let the young apprentice jeweler in the repair workshop study the setting, because Celeste had mentioned he was talented and needed better training than the company had been providing. One afternoon, about 2 months after the incident, she was in the vintage section when an older black man came in with his granddaughter, a little girl of about 8 who was pressed against his side and looking around at everything with very large eyes. He was wearing a parka and work boots, and he told the staff member who came over that he was looking for something for his wife's anniversary, a ring maybe, something that would last. The staff member, a young man who'd been hired in the weeks since the previous manager had departed, recruited from a competing store where, apparently, things were done differently. The staff member said, "Of course. Let me show you what we have. What kind of stones does she like?" The little girl pressed her nose against the display glass. The staff member noticed and didn't say anything about the glass. He just kept talking to her grandfather. Althea watched this from across the room. She picked up her Tim Hortons cup, walked out into the gray Toronto afternoon. Some things you fix, some things you rebuild from the inside out, and some days it's just enough to see a little girl's nose pressed against a glass case in a store where everyone is treated like they belong, and know that this time you made it count.